conservatives will often say that, liberals or leftists are just, obnoxious know-it-alls. They're right. They're right. Okay.
You just know more than them, typically.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's hard. It's impossible not to condescend whenever you hear the insanity that they say. I always point like, you ever wonder why you never meet any left-wing flat earthers? You ever notice that you try as you might, you 99 out of 100 times you will find a flat earther. You're not going to hear them talk about universal health care and how it's a good thing, about how unions are great, or they're going to be religious Christian, well, maybe not necessarily Christian, but religious conservatives, and steeped in superstition and gut feelings and intuition and instinct, and that's how they live their lives.
Paranoia.
Paranoid, yeah. It's like you like. I don't know, conservatives, like, does that bother you that you have all the flat earthers? That all the flat earthers solely belong in your camp? Yeah, it is insanity. Mark says, Jews went through the Holocaust and many came out with their faith, horrific circumstances, and yet they held the hope. I mean, yeah, it's just like most American Christians and most American slaves were Christians, and they still were. I mean, faith. This is like what Marx said. What did he say? That religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature. Yes. It is the
story that gets him through the day. Yeah.
Yeah. It is the heart of a heartless world. It is the opiate of the masses. And a lot of people say it like Marx didn't mean that in a derogatory fashion. The worse your life is, the more likely you are to buy into religion, because we have to cope with this. Living in an incredibly unjust world, and knowing you were born living and dying in a world in which you are getting fucked every single day, and someone else is living like a king, it's wildly unfair. And unfairness is reviled by pretty much all social mammalian species, and not just human beings. I don't know if you've seen these experiments they do with like monkeys, where they'll have the monkey complete a task, and it'll give one monkey a walnut and the other monkey a grape. The monkey that gets the walnut gets really mad. Like, no, that's like, no, that's not cool. So fairness goes way back. So being in a world that's completely unjust and unfair, having the hope that, okay, this is all going to be sorted out one day, isn't like that might be all that gets you up in the morning. Doesn't make it true, but yeah, that's not surprising at all, Mark, that a lot of people held on to their faith. That we demand some sort of order to this. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines, and there's a little too good sometimes. But what you mentioned about the superstition like 20 minutes ago, I'm going to bring up is that it does bother me how easily people flock to superstition in the modern day. Like, you don't have to, like, you don't actually have to buy it. It's like that people are still killing black cats when there's no need for it. I'll see people talking about, even like, and this is the weird thing too. I'm disappointed a lot of times in people who I consider to be smart, and they fall for this nonsense. I saw something years ago about Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs, when he got cancer, he decided to go like on a vegetable juice diet to treat the cancer instead of getting a surgery that could have saved his life. And he did this for like 8 months. And of course it didn't work. And by the time they did the surgery, it was too late. He could still be alive, but it's not limited to just how stupid you are. It's how gullible you are in a lot of ways that we go.
Yeah. And about this being a story, like how much this means to you. Like, this really is, I see it as a tragic fact of like the way that our brains work, that we need these kinds of narratives. All of life, this is sort of more philosophical, but all of life is a narrative. Like our entire subjective experience is a story that we're telling ourselves, right? And we do this it manifests in all kinds of ways. Like someone's buddy, your buddy's girlfriend could very obviously be cheating on him, but he just cannot accept it. He just can't believe it, right? The story that he's telling himself, the story that he needs to believe, involves an untruth, involves a very specific untruth. This is no different. It's just on a macro scale. It's not really, I don't tie it very much to intelligence anymore. It certainly could be in the case of many individuals, but I also, I consider it more of like a, measured by, your level of attachment. This is why, like, post Christianity, I've like coped with a lot of Buddhist teachings, because like coming to terms with the relinquishing of everything, like realizing that I was actually going to die someday, and that was actually like a permanent thing. It required me to live very open-handed. It required me to adjust the way that I like exist in this world. And I think that a lot of this is just measured in that currency. Like, how much do you need this to be okay? You know, and that also ties into, you know, Mark's point about the Jews and the Holocaust. Like, this was part of a narrative that they themselves were living in, and how they contextualized their circumstances. And at the end of the day, for many of them, I'm sure how they made it through, how they survived. Yeah.
All right, so I wanted to ask about film and everything.
Yes.
It took us an hour. We got there, but do you have half an hour more? I don't want to keep you too long.
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Fine. Fantastic. All right. So I wanted to ask what got you into filmmaking. And so I am not a filmmaker by any at all, but I do love cinema. I love, I'm really sad, not necessarily at the loss of DVDs or Blu-rays or whatever, but what I do miss is that I would buy a Blu-ray and of a movie I really liked, and listening to the director's commentary. I loved that. I love doing that. And you can't really do that anymore. Well, you can, but they make fewer and fewer these days with streaming and all that. But what got you interested in filmmaking? Or criticism, or film criticism, or just film in general? Yeah.
I've sort of, if you can't tell by the you know, desert that is my TikTok, I've kind of given up on the criticism, and part of that is in pursuit of being more of a maker.
Right. Yeah.
I look back on some of my videos and I'm like, man, if I ever got to meet this guy, like, I'd be pretty embarrassed to have like trashed him in this way. And also the more that I like in my community and stuff, the more that I got involved in the process of making things, the more that I realized how fucking hard it is. Yeah. And so a lot of criticisms that may be valid are ultimately better left unsaid. And this is not, you know, universally the case, but to answer your question, when I realized how powerful stories could be, and when I realized, you know, how so much of our existence is a narrative that we are feeding ourselves about true events, and in a way fictionalizing them to contextualize them around ourselves. When I realized how powerful that was, and how that connected to so much of what I loved about the world, and what I loved about my experience growing up, and the things that you know, drew me further into them, you know, seeing Gohan turn into a Super Saiyan 2 for the first time, and the magic that made me feel, sort of wrapping my head around all of that made me realize that I want to instill that same feeling in other people. And I want to like live in a world where that is in discussion all the time. This like coincides with a lot of my feelings about like religion and all the things that we've talked about. But when I see my love of like film as a medium, as an extension of that same personality trait, of that same part of myself.
I like that.
If that made any sense.
No, I like it. And it's important to get this out there. Like it's when you're hit with like the storytelling bug and find out what the value that it brings to humanity, you can't help but trying to do something like that. It was an interesting point you said about what if I meet this guy. That's pretty good. I actually hadn't thought about that. Or about the film criticism. It's like, oh yeah, I've been trashing this guy. What if I run into him? That's a good point. So one thing I want to mention is with putting forth a message in film. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here. This is a layman's term. I've created one film in my entire life, and that was a student body video I made in college. I actually loved it. I loved making it. It was a comedy, and it went over really well. So that was a near and dear to my heart. But I get annoyed when people. So I get annoyed, but I do kind of understand. People will complain about films being too woke, or films putting in a message and shit. Because listen, there's no art has ever been created that wasn't sending a message. These people think that, Star Wars is just some space story. No, it has tons of messages in there. You don't got to look hard to find them. And there's no movie that exists that doesn't have some sort of message. However, if the message is heavy-handed and preachy, it's awful. It's just terrible. You got to find a subtle way to do it. And examples that I think of with this is a good one and a bad one. And what was it? Avengers Endgame. In Avengers Endgame, there's a scene where everyone's fighting Thanos, and Peter Parker, I think, has the Infinity Gauntlet, and he's surrounded by all the female Avengers or whatever. Yeah. And it's like it's so cheesy and lame. We're like, oh, okay, they're doing this is the feminist moment, and it's really obvious, and it really hits you over the head with it. And like the boys kind of parodied it with the girls get it done scene or something,
Dude,
like how over the top it was. But a great example of it was The Mandalorian. And I remember in season 2 of The Mandalorian, there's this fight scene that takes place on the ship where they're waiting for Luke Skywalker. And you're 3 minutes into the fight scene before you realize, like, oh my God, this is all women. Like it just sneaks up on you, and boom, it's like that. And at the end, you see it. I was like, that is how you handle that. Like, that is how you want to put this message in of strong women characters that can get it done. But if it's like right in your face, like, oh, hey, did you see that? They're all women. Did you see that? Did you notice that? It's annoying and it's upsetting. So how, in your experience, would you say is a way that people can put forth messages in without being preachy or annoying?
I think the way to do it is to not do it. So in the case of The Mandalorian, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get to that moment, you realize like, oh wait, all 3 of these characters are women. But the point is that they're characters.
Yeah.
You know, the point is that like, no, these 3 people, you know, are here and they all just happen to be women.
Yeah.
You know, I think Disney specifically, a lot of the flack that it's getting about being woke and things like that. I have a lot of those same beefs as someone who cares about progressive ideas.
Yeah.
But the word I would use is corporate, because these decisions are not being made. Because we actually need representation for these things. Because if they were interested in doing that, they would be portraying them as people more. And of course, there are films that do that. I loved Turning Red, for example. Like it's you know, sort of Asian Canadian, like you know, that's an experience that's so distant from me. Like getting to see that film and understand the writer directors you know, experience coming through that, like that's incredible. And it's not heavy-handed and it's not corporate. But the Avengers Endgame thing, that was, you know, a bunch of white dudes sitting around a room going like, how do we bring the women in to buy more tickets? You know, how do we get people to say girl power on their TikToks when the movie's over? So I think the way to do it, if you're trying to convey a message that is overtly about people in a way that, you know, is about a character's identity in any way, just make that person a real person, for the love of God. Just, you know, and it's sort of like, you will realize that you're doing it correctly if you're not fucking doing it. If you're not sitting around going, how do I write a strong female character? Just write the fucking character. Just write the fucking character, make them a real person. You know, because even then you're doing something problematic. I think you're sitting around saying like, oh, well, I can write this, you know, cis white guy super easily because I see him as a person. But this other person is, you know, you know, anything that isn't cis white and male, you know, I have to handle them with extra care, you know, because they're not really a person. They're this enigma that I have to like present to the audience in a palatable way. Like, no, they're just a person. Right? Person, you know. But in the case of like more political ideas, like wider reaching economic, you know, there's a heavy-handed way to do it that's entertaining, and I would call that movie The Platform. It's a Spanish film about
The Platform, the starving, food,
very heavy-handed, but also effective.
Yeah,
if you're trying to do something more subtle than that, I mean, Star Wars is, I wouldn't call it subtle, but it wraps its political message in so many layers of fun that, you know, it's for the intelligent viewer, it's not really that distracting, but it's much more complicated because you get films that I think are very, very powerful films, you know, and this applies to other media, books, comics, whatever. You get pieces of storytelling and literature that are very politically sound and efficient, and yet are wildly misinterpreted. So that's something that I'm like, you know, I'm like digesting that myself all the time. I'm meditating on that constantly. But the fact that like anyone could have read Watchmen and been like, Rorschach's the good guy, or like V for Vendetta, another one, like,
or like, Colonel Jessup is the good guy in A Few Good Men, or something. Like, no, what is wrong with you?
Homelander's the good guy. Yeah. So this how we do much more nuanced political expressions in film and television that's much more complicated than just, you know, writing characters. But at the end of the day, I would kind of say, in the way that I said, you know, at the beginning of this conversation, that I see government and economics and all of these other things as extensions of the project of human well-being, and, you know, socializing ourselves. I think that in that same way, we go back to the individual, and we get the audience to care about an individual in a certain context. So if you want to make a movie about how, or if you want to convey the political idea that like we should not be leaving the little guy behind, right? Tell a story about the little guy and make us feel bad that he's being left behind. You don't have to like come out and say like, God damn it, I wish there were more social programs, you know?
No.
But I think that at the end of the day, like stories are about people. Stories are not about, I mean, they can be about places, but in that case, a place is a person. They can be about an artifact, but in that case, the artifact is a person. Like stories are about people.
Yes.
And if you are telling a story that, you know, you feel needs to convey a certain message, applying that message through the lens of a character that the audience cares about, I think is the only, you know, plausible, efficient way to get that job done.
That's a really good point about how stories are about people, but if it's about a place or an object, they're people too, as far as the story is concerned. Because don't underestimate people's ability to anthropomorphize anything. Like we will go out of our way to make something as human as possible. I want to hit these real quick. TJ has it perfectly. The resurrection is the hope of the world that might be made right. Mark also says that he loves commentaries as well. They're great. I love me a good commentary. And also, Heather says, not TJ sounding like a know-it-all. Hardy, har. That's really good. I wanted to go over a lot of things you mentioned here. So I agree 1,000,000,000% that the best way to put this message in is if you don't notice it. Like you're watching it like maybe the 10th time, like, oh my God, that's what you don't notice if it's subliminal or subconscious. But I think a lot about Christopher Hitchens, and I remember seeing Christopher Hitchens. He used to write for The Nation magazine, and people, it's advice that I've taken to heart. And people asked him how he writes his articles. And he says, he's like, well, I found the key to writing a successful article is to treat the person reading the article like they're your funniest and most intelligent friend. So make obscure references, make jokes with the expectation that your audience is going to get it. They'll appreciate it because everyone likes to think they're funny and everyone likes to think they're smart. Even if they don't understand it, they're going to feel flattered that you think they will. I use this all the time. And it works. And the problem is like, well, it reminds me of Mad Men. I'm doing the weave like Donald Trump says. I'm getting together with this somehow. But I remember Peggy in Mad Men went on a date with this guy, and she mentioned that she was in advertising. And the guy said, well, advertising doesn't work on me. And Peggy said, well, if it's good advertising, you don't know what's working on you. And that's exactly what it's like. However, you do run the risk, like you mentioned, of the audience, it actually going over their heads. And a great example, I wrote down a few examples of this, Starship Troopers. So I remember when Starship Troopers came out, like what, 97, 96? I don't know. It was a long time ago. Yeah. And so I remember seeing the commercials for it. Now, I don't blame you to watch the commercials. Okay, this is a mindless space action movie. Fine. I didn't see it until way later. Honestly, I didn't see Starship Troopers until maybe 3 years ago. But I heard that actually this film was mistaken by American audiences as some sort of brainless action flick when it was a warning for fascism. And then I watched it, jaw on the floor the entire time. If you haven't seen Starship Troopers and you go back and watch it, it looks like it was a film made by a time traveler, like someone who was in modern day America and went back to say, all right, this is a film to warn you guys for what's coming. It's shocking how like everything down to the over the top news people to the glorification of the military to they show like this map of the galaxy and Earth is here and the bug planet is way over here. The other side of the galaxy is like, we need to keep our borders safe from the people on the other side of the galaxy. It's exactly.
That's one of my favorite moments.
And I'm like, how did no one catch this? How were people so fucking dumb they didn't catch this? Because it's not subtle. It's not subtle at all. And they still missed it. Another example I wrote down was Star Trek. That Star Trek is essentially space communism, but people don't see it that way. Like people just see it as, hey, these are cool stories and everything. It's like, oh no, they're talking about how human beings have left behind the need for work or for money, and they have these jobs because they want to do it. They want to fulfill their purpose. There's no shortage of food or anything like that. And it's like, oh yeah, this is communism, but no one sees it. And it just bothers me that, if you do it right, people won't notice it, but a lot of people, unfortunately, won't notice it, like literally.
Or they'll miss the point entirely. They'll get so close. Like the word I often hear about Star Trek is that it's utopian.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's almost as if the creators of the show were trying to express what an ideal human utopia could look like.
Mm-hmm.
It just so happens to be communism. Like,
Yeah.
looks
a lot like it.
We're so close. And that show too, Star Trek is, I mean, I'm not personally a huge fan. Like, I think that I might have just like missed that one as a kid or something. Yeah. But I something I really love about Star Trek is the way that it actually made characters, or it got its political messages across through characters in the way that I was expressing. Like when, Kirk and Uhura kiss, right? Like, yeah, that was a big deal at the time because it was like an interracial kiss and that was wild. But the movie itself is making a commentary that these are people. These people both exist on equal playing ground. And of course they would kiss in whatever context, like that is how you do it to me. If you're making a point that like we are all equal, make us all equal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, it's simultaneously subtle and not subtle at all. And then people tell on themselves, they sort of like their reaction to it lets kind of where they stand. I mentioned Rorschach or whatever. The people who identify with Rorschach, who see Watchmen, who read Watchmen, whatever, and they're like, oh yeah, that guy is me. Like, oh, okay, that guy's you. Like, yeah, you're a fascist. Great.
Yeah, I know. Kind of. We got to, and this is the thing too, is like a lot of times fascist or horrible characters are really cool. And so I see why I like Colonel Jessup, for example, in A Few Good Men. Awful human being. I see why people like him though. Like I see why, like, because he gives that incredibly eloquent speech. He's standing his ground and shit. I can see that sometimes with awful characters. Rorschach is not meant to be envied in any sense at all. Like, you're supposed to pity Rorschach in a lot of ways, but people still flock to him. I'm not sure, but
he's an underdog. Yeah,
people I guess that's it. Yeah, people do like their underdogs and everything. Yes, like this is my favorite interview. Yeah, mine too. This has been fantastic, and I think The Last of Us had character and stories and spoke about several different fairly controversial issues.
That's huge. Yeah, The Last of Us is incredible for that purpose because it is saying so much about, and I actually think my least favorite moment in the way that it tackles complex social or economic issues is when it comes out and says them. There's a moment where Joel and Tommy are like being introduced into Tommy's camp or whatever.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
They basically realize like, oh, this is like communism. Like, no, it's not. Yes, it is communism. That's the only moment where it kind of like breaks its own illusion for me. But that's exactly how you do it. You're talking a lot about, how we prioritize moral values, things like that, how we organize societies in disastrous circumstances, how individuals react to certain personal and extrapersonal tragedies. The Last of Us is an excellent example for this sort of like complicated commentary in very simple moments. And that primarily works because it is focused on the relationship between this father figure and this, young girl, and a very simple journey from them needing to get to place.